Briefing, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm also a constituent of Oakland Mayor Libby Schaaf, who is joining us today to talk about the crisis of policing in Oakland. I know we only have a short time, so I want to get into as much substance as possible. 1 in 1,000 Black men are killed by police in America. According to the American Journal of Public Health, 8% of men killed in the United States are killed by police. People have taken to the streets across the country and around the world after the recent police killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Rayshard Brooks, and too many more. Mayor Schaaf, on June 1st, you joined a youth-led protest march through Oakland. That night, 40 protesters were arrested. I know that Oakland recently banned chokeholds, but protesters were subjected to the use of tear gas and so-called less than lethal ammunition like rubber bullets. Even though these weapons can blind, kill, and in the case of tear gas, accelerate the spread of COVID-19. Mayor Schaaf, will you commit to banning the use of tear gas compounds as well as rubber bullets?
Oakland has already banned the use of rubber bullets. This Oakland Police Department does not have them. We don't have wooden dowels. We don't have sting ball grenades. These are things that Oakland banned a few years ago. One of the complications is on nights like June 1st, we had a tremendous amount of mutual aid and departments that are under different policies and different levels of accountability. And that is why I believe so much of this reform has to be taken up at the state level. Right now, each different agency has different rules, different trainings, different standards, and I really want to push for more accountability, more reduction of force, and you know, I've talked about this toxic macho culture, toxic racist culture in policing. It is part of the history of policing. And I believe that state action is going to be some of the most powerful tools we can use to drive it out and to do it in the fastest way. We are taking up the issue of banning tear gas during the COVID-19 pandemic this evening. I would expect our city council to pass that law tonight.
And that's great that you're taking up the issue of banning tear gas during the COVID-19. Are you open to considering the banning of tear gas even afterward?
What I want to understand is whether or not tear gas allows police to not use other methods. Let me be clear, we already banned tear gas for mere crowd control. It can only be used when there is an imminent threat of harm. And one of the questions that we will be looking at carefully is, was that imminent threat of harm clearly there? Was the use absolutely necessary to preserve safety and prevent harm to people, not just property, people? That's a kind of policy examination that we're going to do. And honestly, if anybody violated those policies, they will be held accountable. What I saw on June 1st was extremely disturbing. Extremely disturbing. And Oakland has had a long, proud history of free expression, of protest, of advancing social justice. And we cannot let police chill that free speech. That is what I'm worried about happened on June 1st. And that's what we will be looking at as we examine the incident. We fully investigate all the complaints that came out of that evening. And I assure you, officers will be held accountable if they violated our policies, as well as our continued re-examination of those policies. That's what I committed to do, is re-examine all of our use of force policies in Oakland.
Thank you for that. Oakland devotes 44% of its annual discretionary spending to police, nearly $300 million a year. Now, I'm not talking about the restricted funds exclusively devoted to construction, repair, replacement of city assets. I know that that's a pot you can't touch. But for the money that you do decide how to allocate, Oakland devotes 44% of that to policing. Meanwhile, we spent only $634,000 on your new violence prevention department, even though studies show that these kinds of programs work, including in Oakland. You have said in the past that you do not believe that Oakland needs to defund police in order to fund other programs. Even while we have slashed services, including $35 million for education, to meet a projected $120 million budgetary shortfall, and that's due to the COVID-19 pandemic. My question for you, Mayor Schaaf, is why not dramatically scale back what we spend on policing to meet our budget shortfall and then invest the additional money in education, violence prevention, and housing, things that we know build thriving communities and actually do prevent violence?
So I am very excited about this moment where we have the opportunity to reimagine safety. And in reimagining safety, it is not just looking at what kinds of responses and functions should be migrated out of the police department and into more care-based, health-based approaches and non-armed departments, but also how we invest in housing security, economic security. That is part of safety. As far as Oakland's current funding levels for its police department, certainly the general fund is not the only, it's the most discretionary fund, but it's not the only discretionary fund. We spend 20% of our overall budget on policing. And remember, things like education, mental health, public health are not part of the 100% against which that 20% is measured. Those are in other agency budgets. Our spending, our 20% is below the average for comparable cities. And Oakland does have the lowest officer per crime staffing levels of any department in America. So I would argue that we already have defunded the police. We are willing to do more. We will do more. The current proposed budget makes the largest cut to the police department. The current budget that's in front of the council cuts nearly $6 million out of policing and adds $23 million for affordable housing, for homeless services, for job training, for addressing the illegal dumping problem in East and West Oakland, which is a big equity issue, as well as park maintenance because of a recently approved measure. And we will do more. We're looking at ways that we can create new systems so that we can, again, migrate responsibilities out of the police department. One thing I'm really excited about this year, and again, other cities are just talking about it, but we actually have spent the last year engaging our community and creating a plan to launch something called Macro. And it is a mobile crisis response unit that is based in the community. It's a community response that, again, uses a mental health or care approach.
I do actually want to talk to you about this first responder development that you've come up with. I read the email to your constituents, as I am one, and you committed to a program, a first responder program, but it did tie medical professional responders to police responders. And I know that many of your constituents have rejected this proposal because they don't want to see the system connected to law enforcement.
Again, that is actually not what we're proposing for Macro. So I'm not quite sure what you're referring to. Macro definitely has to come out of the community. And as far as whether it gets dispatched through the 911 system, which serves both police and fire, or the 211 system, which is more of a social services referral network, that has yet to be determined.
Okay, so my question then is, are you willing to consider a first responder system that is not connected to law enforcement at all?
Absolutely. I think that's what the community wants to see. And that's what, again, Oakland was made for this moment. Oakland has been doing this work, preparing, getting community voice, leading this conversation. And that's what we're hearing. This first year will be a pilot so we can see what works and what doesn't. Hear from the community about what they think is working in this new system and what isn't. And that is the work that will begin this year because we started it a year ago.
Jumping just around a little bit, your office forced a labor negotiation with city employees that resulted in a $10 million loss for working families.
That's actually not true. We have proposed a budget that still has a $10.5 million shortfall in the proposed budget. We have, with all humility, asked our labor unions whether or not there is a mutually agreeable set of concessions that we could engage in. So far, that has not resulted in a specific proposal. And as other types of funding, particularly from the state of California, become more clear, we are constantly looking at ways to avoid the necessity to even engage in a conversation about labor concessions. But that shortfall is in the proposed budget. We are working every day to try and avoid having to have labor concessions, but that's what a concession is. It is a mutually agreed upon a change, and that's the respectful types of conversations we're having with labor. We don't want to hurt our own workers at a time when our economy is suffering. Our workers have sacrificed so much, and I've been a city of Oakland worker myself for 21 years. I personally have been laid off by the city twice. I don't want anyone to experience the trauma, the abject fear of being a parent, of being a provider, and losing your income. And so there will be no layoffs in the city of Oakland, despite the fact that we've had to cut $122 million out of our budget. But we are just working in partnership with our incredible labor leaders to, as a whole community, try and get through the unprecedented economic impact that COVID has had on our ability to deliver city services. But we're doing that with shared values.
Now, we recognize the budget shortfall and what COVID-19 did to the city, but there certainly were conversations about concessions with the labor union, and I don't believe that there were similar negotiations with the police union.
That's not true either. We actually have had meetings. In fact, the police union scheduled their concession meeting before some of our other unions did. So those conversations have been had with all the unions. We are again trying to work in partnership for the long-term well-being of our employees, because we can't take care of our residents unless we take care of the people who take care of them.
And can you tell us a little bit about any of the concessions you have asked the police union to make during this time?
Yes, we've asked them to delay their raises. So there's an upcoming raise that has already been bargained for, and that is the concession that we've asked of them.
Have you proposed any pay cuts for police officers?
We have not proposed pay cuts. Delaying the pay increase would be probably a more palatable way for them. It's essentially a pay cut, right? But that's something that would be easier for them to sell to their membership, and it would accomplish the same savings. It's true that with other workers, we traditionally, again, my first goal is to not have to do concessions, and I'm working very hard on other ways that we can make up for that shortfall, be responsible to future generations of Oaklanders who, again, I got saddled with a lot of debt that my predecessors passed on to me. But I really, asking for sacrifices from our workers is the last resort. It's on the table, but we are working hard every day to make sure that it's not something we have to go to.
Hundreds of protesters have been arrested by Oakland police since the death of George Floyd 3 weeks ago. And I see right here that demonstrations are continuing. On this very program, Mayor Quinton Lucas of Kansas City committed to pardoning protesters. I know that in the past, on other occasions, you have called for pardons from Governor Newsom. Will you ask your county's district attorney, Nancy O'Malley, to do this, including release and clearance of criminal records for protesters arrested in Oakland?
Okay. I am not aware of anyone who was actually arrested and sent to jail merely for the act of protesting. Our policy is to cite and release. And so I will look into that. Certainly, it's not something that should be on people's records. The mere act of speaking should be celebrated. It should not be punished. That has been Oakland's legacy, its values, and certainly something I'm committed to.
You have accepted campaign contributions from law enforcement, including the Oakland Police Foundation, in your 2018 mayoral run.
That's not true.
You have not accepted any campaign contributions from police unions?
I'm aware of a contribution went for my city council race, but as mayor, I've never been endorsed by the police union, and I am not aware, again, I can look into it, but I am not aware of a contribution from the police union since I've been the mayor of Oakland.
And would you commit to refusing contributions from law enforcement unions during the next campaign cycle and beyond?
Sure.
Okay.
Yes.
There are 6,000 vacant homes in Oakland, not counting hotel rooms. And the estimated homeless population in Oakland is roughly 4,000 people. Many of these vacant homes are owned by private hedge funds that are housing speculators. And the number of homeless people in Oakland has jumped by 50% over the past 2 years. Community land trusts are nonprofit organizations that create permanently affordable housing by buying land and entering into long-term affordable leases. Do you support allocating city funds to community land trusts for the purchase of vacant homes to provide permanent low-income housing for the people of Oakland?
Yes, and we already have. And as you may know, I personally negotiated the ability for the Oakland Community Land Trust to purchase the home from Wedgwood Properties that was occupied by the Moms for Housing. The city of Oakland already has set funds aside for community land trusts, and I'm also working to create a piece of legislation called the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act that would require these types of properties to be first offered to nonprofits for their use as affordable housing.
How much can the residents of Oakland look forward to seeing your office support community land trusts? Have you come up with a specific allocation?
Again, I'm sorry I don't remember it offhand, but there already has been one in the budget. It was specifically set aside for community land trusts. I do think, though, that we have to balance the need to house the homeless, which is an issue that generally is not addressed by community land trusts. Community land trusts are generally help people move from renters to owners. I think there are some really creative new ways of thinking about real estate, as well as combating the kind of fiscalization of land. We have Noni Sessions is someone in Oakland that's doing some very innovative work. And so I'm excited to see different models for us to really combat the unacceptable cost of living here that really is driven by housing costs. When we talk about reimagining safety, I believe that part of that conversation has to be about restoring Black wealth, to recognize how home ownership has traditionally been a wealth building path that has been denied based on very clear racist policies, exclusionary zoning laws, redlining. These are wrongs that deserve restitution. And so I'm certainly part of the group that wants to repeal Prop 209. I believe that we need to have conversations and policies that expressly take race into account, because our systems were designed to discriminate against people based on race. And that includes legal systems like land use policies that cities have put in place traditionally. And so I hope this moment where we are focused on racism in policing also expands to the larger conversation about structural racism. And certainly it plays a huge role in homelessness, in just about every other aspect of well-being. And that is the opportunity for government to really start examining all the structures that are in place, not just in policing, but in every single aspect of life that discriminates on the basis of race.
Thank you again for joining us, Mayor Schaaf. We really appreciate you making the time to speak to all of us about these really important issues. Thank you for joining us on the briefing. We will see you again tomorrow at 3:30 Eastern for a candidate forum for New York's 16th Congressional District.